The apartment buzzer screeched through my skull like a fire alarm at 3 a.m. I pressed the button with fingers that trembled from too much coffee and too little sleep, staring at the fancy intercom screen that showed a marble lobby I'd never be able to afford to stand in if I wasn't here for work. 23rd floor, a woman's crisp voice announced through the speaker. The Castellano residence. Castellano. The name meant nothing to me then. Just another wealthy family in Manhattan, with more money than time, hiring help to raise their children while they attended charity galas and business meetings. I'd seen it 100 times during my 4 years teaching kindergarten, before budget cuts eliminated my position along with 20 others. The elevator ride took long enough for doubt to creep in. I'd found this job posting on a Wednesday afternoon, interviewed via video call on Thursday, and been hired by Friday. The salary they'd offered, triple what I'd made teaching, should have raised red flags. But my mother's medical bills had stopped being suggestions and started being threats, and desperate people don't ask questions about miracles. My reflection in the polished elevator doors showed exactly what I was, a 24-year-old woman in clearance rack clothes trying to look professional. My dark blonde hair was pulled back in a bun that already had strands escaping, and my best blazer, the navy one I'd worn to every job interview for the past 6 months, had a loose button I kept meaning to fix. The Mary Janes on my feet were the comfortable teaching shoes I'd refused to throw away, even though the left one had a scuff mark that wouldn't buff out. The elevator chimed at the 23rd floor, opening directly into a private foyer that made my breath catch. This wasn't an apartment. This was a penthouse that occupied the entire floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park and furniture that probably cost more than my entire year's rent. You must be Olivia. A woman in her 50s materialized from a hallway, her gray hair twisted into an elegant chignon, and her black dress speaking of European designers I couldn't name. I'm Mrs. Castellano. The children are in the playroom. Follow me. Mrs. Castellano. The mother? No. Something about her formal bearing suggested housekeeper, or perhaps a relative serving in that capacity. I followed her through rooms that blurred together in a showcase of wealth, marble floors, original artwork, fresh flowers in crystal vases that caught the morning light. The playroom door stood open at the end of the hall, and the chaos that spilled out of it was the first familiar thing I'd encountered. Children's laughter mixed with the sound of blocks crashing, toy cars racing across hardwood, and what sounded like a dramatic reenactment of a battle scene, complete with sound effects. This is where I leave you, Mrs. Castellano said, checking her watch. Mr. Castellano will return this evening. The children's schedule is on the refrigerator, though I suspect you'll need to improvise today. They've been rather energetic since their last nanny left 3 days ago. She disappeared before I could ask why the last nanny had left or how many nannies had preceded her. Warning signs I should have heeded. I stepped into the playroom and was immediately struck by 2 things. First, that this single room was larger than my entire apartment. Second, that it looked like a toy store had exploded inside an Architectural Digest photo shoot. Every educational toy imaginable lined custom-built shelving, but most of them were currently scattered across the floor in what appeared to be the aftermath of a very creative war. 2 children occupied the epicenter of the chaos. A boy who looked about 6 was building an elaborate fortress out of blocks while making explosion noises. A girl who couldn't be more than 4 sat nearby, hosting what appeared to be a very serious tea party for an assortment of stuffed animals, who all looked extremely concerned about world events. Hi there, I said, using my teacher voice, the one that was friendly but firm. I'm Olivia. I'm going to be spending time with you. The boy looked up, suspicion written clearly across features that would be heartbreakingly handsome someday. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his eyes, a striking gray blue, assessed me with an intensity no 6-year-old should possess. Are you another nanny? I am. The last one left because we were too much trouble, he informed me matter-of-factly. Papa said she had no backbone. The little girl abandoned her tea party to study me with equal intensity. She had the same coloring as her brother, but softer features, and her hair was pulled into 2 braids that were already coming loose. "Are you going to leave too?" The question held so much weight, so much barely concealed hurt, that something in my chest cracked open. How many caregivers had these children watched walk away? "Not planning on it," I said, settling onto the floor in a way that immediately put me at eye level with them. A technique I'd learned worked better than looming over children like a giant. "What are we building here?" The boy's suspicion wavered. "A castle, but it keeps falling down." "May I?" I gestured to the blocks, and when he nodded, I began helping him create a more stable foundation. "You need a wider base, like this. What's your name?" "Marco." He watched my hands, then started copying the technique. "My sister is Julia. Those are beautiful names." I glanced at Julia, who was edging closer. "Italian?" "Papa is from Sicily," Julia offered quietly. "Do you know where that is?" "I do. It's an island in the Mediterranean, with beautiful beaches and ancient ruins." I'd never been further than New Jersey, but I'd spent years reading to children and answering their endless questions. You learned a lot that way. "Have you been there?" "Once," Marco said, his enthusiasm growing as the castle took shape. "Papa has a big house there, and Nonna makes the best biscotti." The morning passed in a blur of activity that was simultaneously exhausting and exhilarating. After the castle was completed, we moved on to painting, which resulted in more paint on hands and faces than on paper, then an impromptu dance party that had all 3 of us breathless with laughter, and finally a reading session where both children settled against my sides as I read from a beautifully illustrated book about dragons. Somewhere during those hours, glitter got involved. I'm still not entirely sure how. One moment we were making cards for their grandmother. The next moment there was glitter in my hair, on my clothes, coating my hands like fairy dust that refused to be contained. Marco and Julia thought it was hilarious, and honestly, so did I. We were in the middle of an epic pillow fight. Julia had declared herself queen of the playroom and was defending her throne against all challengers, when I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, measured, in the hallway outside. The children froze mid-throw, pillows clutched in their small hands. The change in them was immediate and startling. Marco straightened his shoulders. Julia quickly tried to smooth her wild hair. Both of them looked toward the door with expressions I couldn't quite read. Love mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Papa's home," Marco whispered. The door opened, and my heart stopped. The man who entered the playroom was not what I'd expected. Somehow I'd pictured a soft businessman in casual weekend clothes, maybe slightly overweight, probably balding. The kind of wealthy New York father who showed up in picture books, suit without the jacket, reading glasses, gentle smile. The man standing in the doorway was none of those things. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that suggested he didn't get it from a gym trainer, but from actual physical work. Dark hair that needed a cut, jaw that needed a shave, and eyes that needed nothing because they were already perfect weapons. Those eyes, the same gray-blue as Marco's but harder, colder, swept the room, taking in the scattered toys, the paint-splattered art station, the pillow fortress, and finally landing on me. I was still holding a pillow, covered in glitter, with Julia's crown, made of construction paper and more glitter, tilted sideways on my head. Not exactly the professional image I'd hoped to present. "What?" he said in a voice that managed to be both soft and dangerous. "Is happening in my home?" Before I could formulate an answer that wouldn't get me fired on my first day, something unexpected happened. Marco and Julia ran to their father, throwing themselves at him with the unself-conscious joy of children who were deeply, completely loved. He caught them both, and for just a moment, his expression transformed, the hard edges softening, something almost vulnerable flickering in those dangerous eyes. Then they returned to me, and the vulnerability vanished. "Papa, this is Olivia," Julia announced, tugging on his hand. "She's our new nanny, and she knows about Sicily, and she's really good at building castles, and she doesn't mind getting messy." "So I see." His gaze traveled from my glitter-covered hair down to my paint-stained Mary Janes and back up again. "Mrs. Castellano hired you?" "Yes, sir." I set down the pillow and straightened, pulling off the construction paper crown with as much dignity as I could muster. "I'm Olivia Reeves. You're aware that my children require structure?" He interrupted, his accent becoming more pronounced with each word. "Discipline? Not—" He gestured at the chaos around us. "Whatever this is," something hot and defiant sparked in my chest. These children had been laughing. They'd been playing. They'd been acting like children, which was exactly what they should be doing. "With all due respect, Mr. Castellano," I heard myself say, each word careful and clear. "What this is called childhood. Your kids just spent 5 hours learning, creating, and having fun. They've had healthy snacks, followed safety rules, and practiced sharing and problem-solving. If you'd prefer a nanny who keeps them silent and still, I'm not your person." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. Marco and Julia's eyes went wide. Somewhere in the apartment, a clock ticked. Mr. Castellano stared at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Nobody spoke to him like that. I could see it in the way he'd gone very still, in the slight tension in his jaw, in the way his hands flexed at his sides. Then, impossibly, one corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make my breath catch. "We'll see," he said finally. "Mrs. Castellano will show you out. The children need their dinner." I gathered my bag with hands that only trembled slightly, said goodbye to Marco and Julia, who looked torn between impressed and worried, and followed Mrs. Castellano back through the elegant rooms to the private elevator. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of Mr. Castellano standing in the hallway, watching me leave with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I'd just talked back to my employer on my first day. I should have been worried about being fired. Instead, all I could think about was whether I'd see those dangerous gray-blue eyes again. I spent the entire subway ride home, convinced I'd just torpedoed my best chance at solving my mother's medical crisis. The practical part of my brain, the part that had survived 24 years of life with more setbacks than successes, kept replaying my words to Mr. Castellano, cataloging all the ways I'd crossed lines most people knew not to approach. My phone buzzed as I climbed the stairs to my third-floor walk-up in Queens, where the hallway always smelled like Mrs. Chen's cooking from apartment 3C, and the radiator had been making concerning noises since October. Unknown number. "Hello? Miss Reeves." I recognized his voice immediately, that accent wrapping around my last name in a way that made my spine straighten instinctively. "This is Nico Castellano." Nico, not Mr. Castellano. I wasn't sure if that was better or worse. "Mr. Castellano," I replied, fumbling with my keys outside my door. My children haven't stopped talking about you." He said it like an accusation. "Marco wants to know if you'll help him build a drawbridge tomorrow. Julia keeps asking if you're really coming back." I got the door open and stepped into my studio apartment, all 400 square feet of it, with my bed visible from the kitchen and the bathroom door that didn't quite close all the way. The contrast between this space and his penthouse was almost laughable. "I'd like to come back," I said carefully, "if you're willing to give me another chance." Silence stretched between us, broken only by his breathing and the distant sound of traffic on his end. "How much did Mrs. Castellano offer you?" I named the figure, which was already generous by any standard. "I'll double it." My legs gave out. I sat heavily on my bed, which doubled as my couch, and tried to process what he'd just said. That amount of money would not just cover my mother's current bills, but give me breathing room, actual savings, a cushion against the disasters that kept finding me. Why? The question escaped before I could stop it. Because my children need stability more than they need someone who's afraid of me. His voice held something I couldn't quite identify, and because you're the first nanny who's treated them like children instead of expensive accessories. I still think you're making a mistake, I said honestly. I'll probably say something else that offends you within the week. I have a problem with your mouth. He sounded amused now. Yes, I noticed. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Don't be late. He hung up before I could respond. I stared at my phone for a long moment, trying to understand what had just happened. Then I called the hospital billing department and made arrangements to start paying down my mother's debt. The next morning, I arrived at exactly 7:55 a.m., determined to prove I could be professional despite yesterday's chaos. I'd even bought a new blazer from the thrift store on my way home. Dark gray, no loose buttons, almost like something a real professional would wear. Mrs. Castellano met me at the elevator with a look that suggested she'd expected me to be a no-show. The children are finishing breakfast. Mr. Castellano would like to speak with you first. His office is the second door on the left. The office matched its owner. Expensive, elegant, and slightly intimidating. Dark wood furniture, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes in multiple languages. And there, behind a desk that probably cost more than my car, sat Nico Castellano. In daylight filtering through the massive windows, he was even more striking than I remembered. The scruff on his jaw was intentional rather than neglectful. The white shirt he wore, sleeves rolled to his elbows, top buttons undone, revealed the kind of chest that came from labor, not leisure. Everything about him screamed power, from his posture to the watch on his wrist, to the way he studied me over the rim of his coffee cup. Sit. He gestured to one of the leather chairs. We need to discuss terms. I sat, back straight, hands folded in my lap like a good student waiting for the principal's judgment. My children, he began, setting down his coffee with deliberate care, have been through 5 nannies in the past year. Some quit because Marco can be difficult. Some left because Julia cries when she misses her mother. Some simply couldn't handle the requirements of this position. Where is their mother? I asked, then immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry, that's not... Dead. The word was flat, final. 3 years ago. Car accident. The grief that flickered across his face lasted only a second, but it was enough to humanize him in a way that made my chest ache. Suddenly the children's initial suspicion made perfect sense. They'd lost their mother, and then watched a parade of caregivers abandon them too. I see, I said softly. Do you? He leaned forward, elbows on his desk. Do you understand what you're agreeing to? These children need someone who won't leave. Someone who will be there when Marco has nightmares about his mother. Someone who can handle Julia's separation anxiety when I travel for business. Someone strong enough not to run when things get difficult. I don't run, I said, meeting his gaze even though everything about him suggested I should look away. I've dealt with difficult before. I'm still here. Something shifted in his expression, assessment giving way to a different kind of interest. Tell me about your mother. The change of subject threw me. What? Mrs. Castellano mentioned during your interview that you're helping with medical expenses. What happened? I hadn't expected this conversation. Hadn't planned to share personal details with a man who made my instincts scream danger, even as something else entirely whispered, pay attention. Breast cancer, I heard myself say. Stage 3. The insurance only covers so much, and she needs... I stopped, realizing I was sharing too much. She needs treatments the insurance won't pay for. Nico nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. And that's why you're willing to work for someone like me. Someone like you? I echoed. His smile was sharp and not particularly kind. "Come now, Miss Reeves. You're an intelligent woman. You've been in my home for less than 24 hours. Surely you've noticed certain inconsistencies." I had noticed. The security cameras in every hallway. The way Mrs. Castellano moved through the apartment checking locks and windows with practiced efficiency. The expensive artwork that looked too much like investment rather than decoration. The private elevator that required a key card to access. Most of all, I'd noticed the way other people in the building lobby had given Nico Castellano a wide berth this morning, the way the doorman had called him Don instead of Mr. "I've noticed you have excellent security," I said carefully. His laugh was genuine, transforming his face entirely. "Diplomatic. I appreciate that." He stood, moving around the desk to lean against it, close enough that I caught his scent, something expensive with notes of cedar and bergamot. "Let me be direct, since you seem to value honesty. My business is complicated. Some of it is legal. Some of it," he shrugged elegantly, "operates in areas where legal and illegal become matters of perspective." My mouth went dry. "Are you telling me you're—" "I'm telling you," he interrupted smoothly, "that working for me comes with certain considerations. You'll be in my home. You'll be around my children. People will ask questions about what you see, what you hear. I need to know you can be discreet." This was the moment I should have stood up, thanked him for his time, and walked away. This was when every self-preservation instinct should have kicked in. Instead, I thought about my mother's medical bills, about Marco asking if I'd help with his drawbridge, about Julia's small hand in mine as we'd read together, about the salary that would let me breathe for the first time in years. "I can be discreet," I said. "Can you?" He moved closer, near enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. "Or will you run the first time something frightens you? The first time you see something you shouldn't? The first time someone asks uncomfortable questions?" "I don't run," I repeated, this time with steel in my voice. "You said yourself, I'm here because your children need someone who stays. I stay." For a long moment, he simply looked at me. Then he extended his hand. 1 year, full salary, plus medical insurance that will cover your mother's treatments completely. In exchange, you care for my children as if they were your own. You maintain discretion about anything you might observe in this household. And his grip tightened slightly when I took his hand. You don't lie to me about anything, ever. His hand was warm, calloused in places that suggested he did more than sign papers and attend meetings. The handshake lasted a beat too long, his thumb brushing against my wrist in a way that made my pulse jump. "Deal," I managed. He released my hand slowly, deliberately. "Good. The children are waiting for you. And Miss Reeves?" He smiled, and it was the most dangerous thing I'd seen yet. "Welcome to the family." I left his office on unsteady legs, my hand still tingling from his touch, and wondered what kind of family I'd just agreed to join. In the playroom, Marco and Julia were waiting with enough energy to power a small city and absolutely zero knowledge that their father had just turned their new nanny into something else entirely. Something like an accomplice. The first month passed in a whirlwind of routines and revelations. I learned that Marco had his father's strategic mind trapped in a 6-year-old body, that he thought 12 moves ahead during board games and one with a smile that would someday break hearts. I discovered that Julia's tears weren't weakness, but intelligence. She'd learned early that emotions were tools, and she wielded them with precision that should have been disturbing, but was mostly just effective. I learned their rhythms. Marco woke at 6:30 every morning without an alarm, already planning his day. Julia needed 20 minutes of snuggling before she'd consider getting out of bed. They both liked their toast cut into triangles and refused to eat pasta unless it was a specific shape that apparently only existed in Sicily. I learned the household's rhythms too. Mrs. Castellano, whose first name I discovered was actually Rosa, ran the penthouse with military efficiency but genuine warmth. The security team rotated in 8-hour shifts, different faces but the same watchful presence. And Nico. Nico was harder to learn. Some days he was gone before the children woke, returning after they'd gone to bed. Those nights I'd hear him in his office, speaking rapid Italian on phone calls that made his voice turn cold and sharp. Other days he'd surprise us all by appearing at lunch, loosening his tie as he sat down to eat grilled cheese with Marco and Julia, like he had nowhere else in the world to be. He never asked about my mother directly, but the medical bills stopped coming. When I called the hospital to check on the balance, they informed me it had been paid in full and her treatments were covered under an upgraded insurance plan. I'd tried to thank him, but he'd simply said, "We had an agreement," and changed the subject. It was during the second month that things began to shift. I'd just gotten the children settled for their afternoon quiet time. Marco reading in his room, Julia supposedly napping but probably plotting world domination, when I heard voices from Nico's office. Low, tense, in Italian. I shouldn't have listened. That wasn't part of our agreement. Wasn't part of my discretion promise. But then I heard a crash, and instinct overrode caution. I knocked once and pushed the door open to find Nico standing behind his desk, jaw tight, facing down 2 men I didn't recognize. Both were older, expensively dressed, with faces that said they'd seen things I didn't want to imagine. "I said we'll discuss this later," Nico was saying, his voice dangerously quiet. "Don Castellano," one of the men replied, the title making my stomach clench. "This cannot wait. The shipment—" "Mr. Castellano," I interrupted, using the voice I'd perfected for dealing with difficult parents at my old teaching job, pleasant but firm. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Marco has a question about his homework that he says only you can answer." It was a lie. Marco was reading a book about pirates and hadn't mentioned homework once, but something about the tension in the room made my protective instincts flare, and those instincts didn't distinguish between the children in my care and their father. All 3 men turned to look at me. The 2 strangers' expressions ranged from surprise to something that might have been amusement. Nico's face showed nothing, but his eyes, those gray-blue eyes that I'd learned to read better than I should, held something that looked almost like relief. "Gentlemen," he said, not breaking eye contact with me. "We'll continue this conversation later. Stefano, Marco's homework awaits." The men left with minimal protest, though I caught one of them murmur something in Italian that made the other chuckle. When the door closed behind them, Nico circled his desk with slow, measured steps. "Marco doesn't have homework," he observed. "I know." I crossed my arms. "But you look like you needed an exit." "Did I?" He moved closer, and I fought the urge to step back. "Or did you just insert yourself into a situation you couldn't possibly understand?" "I understand body language," I countered. "I understand when someone's outnumbered. And I understand that whatever they wanted, you weren't comfortable discussing it right then." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or respect. "You should go back to the children." "I should," I agreed, but didn't move. "Are you all right?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, the hardness in his face cracked, revealing something raw and exhausted underneath. "Do you know what my father used to say?" he asked instead of answering. "That we build empires to protect the people we love, but sometimes the empire becomes a prison of its own making." I thought about that, about this penthouse fortress, about the security cameras and the rotating guards, and the way Nico carried himself like a man constantly at war. You could walk away. His laugh was bitter. Could I? And what happens to Marco and Julia then? What happens to the people who depend on me? What happens to the families whose livelihoods rely on my decisions? He moved to the window, hands in his pockets. You can't simply walk away from being who you are, Olivia. The use of my first name sent a small shock through my system. He'd been carefully formal for 2 months, maintaining distance even as we orbited each other in the contained universe of his home. Your children miss you, I said quietly. When you're gone, they save up stories to tell you. Marco practices his jokes so he can make you laugh. I know. His reflection in the window looked haunted. I'm trying to build something better for them, something legitimate. But the old business... He stopped himself. I'm telling you too much. You can trust me, I said, and meant it. He turned then, studying me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Can I? You've been here 2 months. 2 months in a world you don't understand. Working for a man you should fear. I don't fear you. You should. I don't, I repeated, moving closer without thinking about it. I see how you are with your children. How you protect them. How you're trying to give them a normal life in the middle of all this. That's not someone to fear. That's someone to respect. The space between us had somehow shrunk to inches. I could see the slight stubble on his jaw, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow, the way his pupils dilated as he looked at me. Olivia, he started. Papa! Julia's voice called from down the hall. Olivia, come quick. Marco's pirate ship is stuck on the bookshelf. The spell broke. Nico stepped back, running a hand through his hair. You should go. The pirates await. I went, but I could feel his gaze following me down the hallway. That evening, after the children were asleep, I found a note on the kitchen counter in bold, decisive handwriting. Thank you for the rescue. N. Such a small thing. Barely a sentence. But I kept that note in my pocket for the rest of the week, pulling it out when I needed to remind myself that beneath the dawn, beneath the dangerous businessman, there was a man who'd learned to say thank you to someone who didn't run when things got complicated. The 3rd month brought my first real test. I was walking with Marco and Julia in Central Park, Mrs. Castellano trailing discreetly behind as she always did when we left the penthouse, when I noticed a man taking pictures. Not of the park, of us, of the children. Every teacher instinct I'd ever developed screamed danger. Marco, Julia, I said calmly, taking each of their hands. Let's go feed the ducks by the fountain. I steered them toward the fountain where more people were gathered, where Mrs. Castellano could close the distance, where the photographer would have a harder time staying unnoticed. My phone was already out, texting the number Nico had given me for emergencies. In the park. Someone's watching the children, heading to fountain. The response was immediate. Don't move. Help is coming. Olivia? Marco asked, sensing my tension. What's wrong? Nothing, sweetheart. Just being careful. I kept my voice light even as I scanned the crowd, tracking the photographer who was now speaking urgently into his phone. This was what Nico had meant. This was the danger that came with his name, his position. I'd agreed to discretion, but I hadn't fully understood what that discretion would protect them from. Mrs. Castellano reached us first, her face tight. Stay close. 3 security men appeared from different directions. I recognized 2 from the penthouse rotation. They moved with practiced efficiency, 2 creating a barrier between us and the photographer, while the 3rd guided us toward a waiting car. We were back at the penthouse within 15 minutes. Marco and Julia seemed to think it was an adventure, chattering excitedly about the surprise ride. I was shaking. Nico was waiting in the foyer when we arrived, still in his work clothes but somehow looking more dangerous than I'd ever seen him. His gaze went immediately to the children, checking them over with swift efficiency before landing on me. Take Marco and Julia to the playroom, he said quietly. Mrs. Castellano will be with you shortly. I wanted to argue. wanted to know who that man was and what he wanted. But the children needed normal, needed to feel safe, so I nodded and led them away from whatever storm was about to break. An hour later, Nico appeared in the playroom doorway. The children were absorbed in a building project, giving him a perfect opportunity to gesture me into the hallway. "You did well," he said without preamble. "Quick thinking, correct protocol." Who was he? A reporter, looking for leverage. His jaw tightened. He won't be a problem again. I didn't ask what that meant. Didn't want to know. "This is my life," Nico continued, voice low. "This is what I meant about understanding. People will always be looking for weaknesses, for ways to hurt me. My children." He stopped, drew a breath. "You protected them today. Not just their safety, but their innocence. You didn't scare them. That's my job." "No." He moved closer, and I caught that cedar and bergamot scent again. "Your job is to supervise them. What you did today was mothering. There's a difference." The word settled between us, weighted with meaning neither of us was ready to examine. "They're wonderful children," I said quietly. "Anyone would..." "Not anyone." He cut me off gently. You stayed calm. You thought strategically. You protected them without making them afraid." His hand came up, hesitating before tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Thank you." His touch lingered, thumb brushing my cheekbone, and suddenly the air between us felt charged with something that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with possibility. "Nico," I whispered, not even sure what I was asking for. "I know," he said, reading the question I hadn't voiced. His hand fell away. "But you work for me. You care for my children. We can't." "I know," I echoed. But as I returned to the playroom, I understood that something had fundamentally shifted. We'd crossed a line neither of us could name, into territory that was dangerous for entirely different reasons than security threats or family empires. I was falling for my employer. And from the way he'd looked at me, like I was both the answer to a question he'd stopped asking and the greatest risk he'd ever considered, I suspected I wasn't falling alone. The 4th month started with Julia's 5th birthday party. "Small gathering," Nico had said when I'd asked about plans. "Just family." Family, it turned out, meant approximately 40 people filling the penthouse with enough noise and laughter to wake the entire building. I met cousins and uncles and second cousins once removed, all with Italian names I struggled to remember, and dark eyes that assessed me with varying degrees of curiosity. Nico's mother, Nonna Sofia, arrived like royalty, a tiny woman with steel-gray hair and the same piercing gaze as her son. She'd studied me for a long, uncomfortable moment before pulling me into a crushing hug and declaring in heavily accented English that anyone who made her grandchildren smile was family. It should have been overwhelming. Instead, I found myself in the kitchen with 3 of Nico's aunts, learning to make proper tiramisu while they gossiped in rapid-fire Italian that occasionally switched to English for my benefit. "You're good for him," Aunt Francesca said, gesturing with a wooden spoon. "Too serious, that boy. Works too much. Carries too much weight." "I just care for the children," I protested. The 3 women exchanged glances that needed no translation. I felt my cheeks heat. "Sure," Aunt Teresa said with a knowing smile. "The children, of course." I escaped to find Marco showing his cousins his collection of model cars, explaining each one with such earnest pride that it made my heart ache. Julia was surrounded by relatives bearing gifts, her laughter ringing out as she opened each package with theatrical enthusiasm. And Nico was watching me. I felt his gaze before I saw him, that prickling awareness that had become familiar over the past months. He stood near the windows with a glass of wine, surrounded by men in expensive suits who seemed to be conducting business even at his daughter's birthday party. But his attention wasn't on them. Our eyes met across the room, and something electric passed between us. He raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement, and I felt heat bloom in my chest that had nothing to do with the crowded space. "Miss Olivia," Julia's voice cut through the moment. "Come see what Nana gave me." I spent the rest of the party in constant motion, supervising cake distribution, mediating disputes over who got which color balloon, wiping frosting off small faces. Professional, appropriate, everything a good nanny should be. But I was always aware of where Nico was. How he moved through the crowd with easy authority. How he softened when Marco tugged on his sleeve to show him something. How his gaze kept finding me, even when he was deep in conversation with his uncles. The party wound down as evening approached. Guests departed with kisses on both cheeks and promises to see everyone soon. Marco and Julia, sugar-crashed and exhausted, were bathed and tucked into bed with minimal protest. I was cleaning up wrapping paper in the playroom when Nico appeared in the doorway. "Leave it," he said quietly. "Mrs. Castellano will handle it in the morning." "I don't mind." "Olivia." The way he said my name stopped me mid-reach for a discarded ribbon. "Come with me." I followed him through the quiet penthouse to his study, my heart hammering against my ribs. This felt different from our previous encounters in this space. Less professional, more personal. He closed the door behind us and moved to the bar cart, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "You were remarkable today. I just helped with a party. You fit perfectly into my family," he interrupted, handing me a glass. "My mother adores you. My aunts are already planning our wedding in their heads." I nearly choked on the wine. "What?" He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Italians. They see a single man and a woman who's good with his children, and suddenly it's a romance novel." He took a long drink. "Even though they all know better." "Know better?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Know that you deserve better than someone like me." He set his glass down with deliberate care. "Someone whose phone doesn't ring at 3 a.m. with crises. Someone who doesn't need security teams following his children to the park. Someone who can give you a normal life." "I never asked for normal," I said, surprised by my own honesty. The wine had loosened something inside me, or maybe it was just the cumulative effect of 4 months spent in orbit around this man, pretending I didn't feel the gravitational pull between us. "You should." He moved closer, and suddenly we were back in that charged space we'd occupied in the hallway after the park incident. "You should want safety, stability, someone who isn't constantly balancing legitimate business with family obligations that operate in gray areas." "Stop telling me what I should want," I said, setting my own glass down. "Stop treating me like I'm too naive to understand what I signed up for." "What did you sign up for, Olivia?" His voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You came here for a job, to help your mother, to give my children stability. But this..." He gestured between us. "This wasn't part of the agreement." "No," I agreed, my pulse racing. "It wasn't." We stared at each other across 3 feet of charged air. I could see his internal battle playing out, duty warring with desire, protection instincts clashing with something more primal. The same battle I'd been fighting every time he smiled at something Marco said, every time he gentled his voice for Julia, every time I caught him watching me with that expression that made my breath stop. "Tell me to back away," he said quietly. "Tell me this is inappropriate, that I'm your employer, and you're my employee, and we need to maintain boundaries." "I can't," I whispered. Something broke in his expression. He closed the distance between us in 2 strides, and then his hands were cradling my face and his mouth was on mine. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined. Not gentle or testing, but hungry, almost desperate. Like he'd been holding back for so long that the dam had finally burst. His lips moved against mine with practiced skill, but there was emotion beneath the technique, something raw and real that made my knees weak. I grabbed his shirt for balance, my fingers finding the warm skin where he'd left buttons undone. He made a sound low in his throat, pulling me closer until there was no space between us. One hand threaded through my hair while the other settled at my waist, possessive and sure. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "We can't," he started. "I know," I said. "The children. I know. This complicates everything. I know." He kissed me again, softer this time, almost reverent. "Tell me to stop." "I can't," I repeated. "I don't want to." His thumb traced my lower lip. "What are we doing, Tesoro?" The endearment in Italian sent warmth flooding through me. "I don't know, but I'm not running." "You should. Then you shouldn't have hired someone so stubborn." That pulled a real laugh from him, his whole face transforming. "Fair point." We stood there in his study, wrapped in each other's arms, while reality slowly reasserted itself around us. This changed everything. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "The children can't know," he said finally. "Not yet. Not until we understand what this is." "Agreed. And if it doesn't work..." His jaw tightened. "If this falls apart, they've already lost so much. I won't let them lose you too." The protectiveness in his voice, the way he put Marco and Julia first even in this, made me fall a little harder. "It won't fall apart," I said with more confidence than I felt. "You can't promise that." "No," I admitted, "but I can promise I'll fight for them, for us. I don't run, remember?" He kissed my forehead, gentle and sweet. "I remember." The next morning started like any other, except for the electricity that crackled whenever Nico and I were in the same room. Marco noticed first, of course, his father's son in every way, including observation skills. "Why are you smiling weird?" he asked me over breakfast. "I'm not smiling weird," I protested. "Yes, you are." He squinted at me. "And Papa keeps looking at you." From his position by the coffee maker, Nico choked slightly on his espresso. Our eyes met, and I had to work very hard not to smile wider. "Papa always looks at everyone," Julia said, with the supreme logic of a 5-year-old. "That's how seeing works." Marco rolled his eyes at his sister, but let the subject drop in favor of planning his day's activities. Mrs. Castellano, however, missed nothing. As she cleared the breakfast dishes, she caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod, approval or acknowledgement. I wasn't sure which. Either way, it felt like a blessing. The 5th month passed in a delicate dance of maintaining normalcy for the children while navigating our new reality. Stolen kisses in the hallway when Marco and Julia were occupied. Nico's hand finding mine under the dinner table. Late-night conversations in his study after the children were asleep, where we talked about everything and nothing. His childhood in Sicily, my dreams of opening my own school someday, the weight of responsibility we both carried. "I never thought I'd have this again," he told me one night, his arms wrapped around me as we sat on his study's leather couch. After losing Maria, his late wife's name came out rough. "I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd focus on the children and the business and nothing else." "Tell me about her," I said quietly. He was silent for a long moment. "She was my parents' choice, an arranged marriage, very traditional. We were friends more than lovers. She gave me 2 beautiful children and died too young." His voice tightened. "The accident was meant for me. Wrong place, wrong time. She paid the price for my enemy's vengeance." I turned in his arms to look at him, seeing the guilt he carried. "You can't blame yourself for that." "Can I?" His laugh was bitter. "I chose this life. She didn't sign up to die for it." "And I did," I challenged. "Sign up for this? The danger? The complications? That's different." "How?" I cupped his face, making him look at me. How is it different? Because I knew what I was walking into. Nico, I chose you. I choose you. Every day. He kissed me then, deep and thorough, like he was trying to communicate everything words couldn't express. When we broke apart, his eyes held something I hadn't seen before. Hope. I want to introduce you properly, he said, as more than Marco and Julia's nanny. To my business associates, my family. I want them to know you're mine. Mine. The possessiveness should have bothered me. Instead, it sent heat pooling in my stomach. What about the children? I asked. When do we tell them? Soon. He pressed his lips to my forehead. When we're sure this is permanent. When I can promise them they won't lose you. You can promise that now. Can I? He pulled back to look at me seriously. My world isn't safe, Olivia. I'm trying to legitimize the business, to move away from the old ways. But there are still threats. Still people who would hurt you to hurt me. Then we'll be careful, I said. But I'm not leaving. You need to understand that, Nico. Whatever comes, I'm not running. He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. Then we do this right. Slowly. Carefully. For them. For them, I agreed. What we didn't know, what neither of us could have predicted, was that our careful plans were about to be destroyed by forces neither of us could control. The transition happened gradually, naturally. By month 6, I was having dinner with Nico's business associates, introduced as someone important to the family. By month 8, I was attending charity galas, where people whispered about Don Castellano's new companion. By month 9, the children were casually mentioning to their friends that Olivia might become family officially someday. We hadn't told them yet. Not formally. But Marco and Julia were smart enough to read between the lines, to notice how their father looked at me, how his hand found the small of my back at public events, how we said goodnight now with a kiss that lasted a beat too long. Are you going to be our new mommy? Julia asked one night as I tucked her in, her brown eyes, so like Nico's, studying me with disturbing perception. My breath caught. Would you like that? She thought about it seriously. I loved Mama. I don't really remember her much, but I loved her. I know, sweetheart. That's okay. But, she twisted the edge of her blanket. I love you too. Is that okay? Tears burned my eyes. That's more than okay. That's perfect. She smiled then, satisfied, and settled into sleep. I found Nico waiting in the hallway, his expression soft in the dim light. You heard? I whispered. He nodded. And? I think we should tell them, officially. They already know. His kiss was gentle, reverent. Tomorrow, at dinner. We'll tell them tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. I was walking back from the grocery store the next afternoon, Mrs. Castellano's day off, just a quick trip for ingredients to make Marco's favorite cookies, when I noticed the black sedan. Third time I'd seen it in 4 blocks. Different from Nico's security team, whose vehicles I'd learned to recognize. My phone was already out, thumb hovering over Nico's number, when a man stepped into my path. Miss Reeves. He was average height, average build, completely forgettable except for the cold calculation in his eyes. We should talk. I don't think so. I tried to step around him, but 2 more men materialized from doorways, boxing me in. Mr. Gambino would like a word. The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it suggested it should. About Don Castellano's business arrangements. Fear spiked through me. I don't know anything about... Please don't insult our intelligence. His smile was all teeth. You live in his home. Care for his children. Share his bed. You know things. The crude way he referenced my relationship with Nico made my skin crawl. I'm just the nanny. Are you? He moved closer, and I caught the scent of stale cigarettes. Our sources say otherwise, Say you're quite important to the Don, important enough that he might be willing to negotiate to get you back. The world tilted sideways. Get me back? I tried to run then, but one of the men grabbed my arm with bruising force. The grocery bag fell, apples rolling across the sidewalk. I opened my mouth to scream, but something sharp pricked my neck. A needle, and the world went fuzzy at the edges. Don't fight it, the first man said as my knees buckled. Mr. Gambino just wants to have a conversation. If the Don cooperates, you'll be home for dinner. The last thing I remember before darkness claimed me was thinking about Julia's question, about how I'd told her tomorrow we'd make everything official, about how I'd promised never to leave. I woke to darkness and the smell of mildew. My head throbbed where it had hit something during the transfer, and my hands were bound behind my back with zip ties that cut into my wrists. Panic surged, but I forced it down. Panic wouldn't help. I needed to think. The space was small. A basement maybe, or storage room. Concrete walls, no windows, a single door. The zip ties on my wrists were tight but not impossible. I'd worked with kids long enough to know how to slip out of restraints. Marco had gone through a phase of tying everyone up during pirate games. I was working my hands free when the door opened. Light flooded in, and a man entered. Older than the ones who'd grabbed me, with silver hair and expensive suit that would have looked at home at Nico's charity galas. Miss Reeves. His voice was cultured, almost kind. I apologize for the rough handling. My associates can be overzealous. You kidnapped me, I said, managing to keep my voice steady. I invited you to a meeting. He pulled up a folding chair and sat, gesturing to someone outside. Another man brought in a second chair and cut my zip ties, though 2 guards remained by the door. Let's talk about Nico Castellano. I don't know anything about his business. Perhaps not, but you know the man. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. I'm Antonio Gambino. Don Castellano and I have been competing for control of several operations. Shipping, primarily. He's been undercutting my prices, stealing my clients, making me look weak. That's not my problem. His smile was cold. It is now, because the man who claims to be transitioning to legitimate business is still operating in my territory, still making deals that cut into my profits. And he needs to be reminded that actions have consequences. Understanding dawned with sickening clarity. You're using me to threaten him. To negotiate, he corrected. He backs off my operations, stops his expansion into my territories, and you go home safely. Simple business. I won't help you. You don't have to help. He stood, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve. You just have to exist. Your value isn't in what you know, Miss Reeves. It's in what you mean to Don Castellano. He left, and the guards locked the door behind him. I immediately resumed working my newly freed hands, feeling along the walls for any weakness, any potential escape route. They'd underestimated me. First mistake. They'd left me alone. Second mistake. They'd assumed I'd sit quietly and wait to be rescued. Third and final mistake. I'd told Nico I didn't run. That was true. But I also didn't sit still when people I loved were in danger. Somewhere above me, I heard shouting. Then gunfire. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering. The door burst open, not Gambino's men, but ones I recognized. Nico's security team. Clear, one shouted, then spotted me. Found her. And then Nico was there, pushing past his men, his face a mask of barely controlled rage that cracked when he saw me. Olivia. I ran to him. Or maybe he ran to me. Either way, we collided in the doorway, his arms wrapping around me with crushing intensity. I'm okay, I said against his chest. I'm okay. You're bleeding. His hands found the cut on my forehead where I'd hit something during the abduction. Christo, when they called, when they said they had you. I know. I pulled back to look at him, seeing the fear beneath the fury. But I'm here. I'm safe. Gambino's dead. The coldness in his voice made me shiver. I made sure of it personally. I should have been horrified, should have been shocked by the casual way he referenced killing someone. Instead, all I felt was profound relief that the immediate threat was over. The children, I said suddenly. Marco and Giulia. Safe at the penthouse with my mother. He cupped my face, forcing me to meet his eyes. You're never leaving my sight again. Do you understand? Never. Nico, I can't lose you. His voice broke on the words. I already lost Maria. I won't. I kissed him, cutting off the spiral of panic. You won't. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. The drive back to the penthouse passed in tense silence. Nico held my hand the entire time, his grip almost painful, like he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. His security team had tripled, cars in front and behind, additional men stationed at every entrance. This was his world. The violence I'd chosen to overlook, the danger I'd minimized in my own mind. Real. Immediate. Targeted directly at me because of my connection to him. Marco and Giulia were waiting in the foyer when we arrived, flanked by Nonna Sofia and Mrs. Castellano. The children took one look at us, at Nico's grim expression and the cut on my forehead, and burst into tears. You said she'd be safe, Marco accused his father, his voice breaking. You promised nothing would happen to her. Marco, Nico started. No. Tears streamed down his face. First Mama, now Olivia almost. I knelt down, ignoring my shaking legs, and pulled both children into my arms. I'm here. I'm safe. Your papa saved me. But they took you, Giulia sobbed. The bad men took you like they took Mama. My eyes met Nico's over the children's heads. This was the price of his world. Not just physical danger, but the trauma of knowing people you loved could be stolen at any moment. Listen to me, I said firmly, pulling back to look at both of them. Sometimes bad things happen. Your papa can't always prevent them, no matter how hard he tries. But he will always come for us. He will always fight to bring us home. Do you understand? Marco scrubbed at his eyes. But what if next time? There won't be a next time, Nico said, his voice hard with conviction. I'm done with the old business. Completely done. No more operations in gray areas. No more territorial disputes. Just legitimate business from now on. You can't just walk away, I said quietly. Watch me. He looked at Nonna Sofia. Mama, call the family. Tell them I'm divesting from all the old operations. They can split my territories however they want. I'm out. His mother's eyes widened. Nico, you can't. I can and I will. He looked at me, at the children. My family is more important than any empire. The next weeks were a controlled chaos of meetings, negotiations, and careful exits from businesses that had defined the Castellano name for generations. Nico worked with lawyers to legitimize everything that could be legitimized and sell off everything that couldn't. His uncles protested. His cousins called him a fool. But he held firm. You're giving up millions, one of his associates said during a tense meeting I overheard. Years of building. And gaining what? Nico cut him off. My children's safety? My peace of mind? The ability to walk down the street with the woman I love without looking over my shoulder for threats? The woman I love. He'd said it casually, in front of his business associates, like it was simply fact. Not a declaration or a question, but a statement of reality. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the penthouse was quiet, I found him on the terrace overlooking the city. You didn't have to do all that, I said, sliding into his arms. Walk away from everything. Yes, I did. He pressed his lips to my hair. The moment I realized I loved you more than I feared losing power, the choice became simple. I never asked you to choose. I know, but I'm choosing anyway. He tilted my face up to his. Marco's right. I can't protect you from everything, but I can minimize the risks. I can build something legitimate that doesn't require looking over our shoulders constantly. It won't be easy, I warned. Starting over, building something new. He smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded. Nothing worth having is ever easy. You taught me that. I did? You walked into my life covered in glitter, told me off about how to raise my own children, and refused to run when you learned what I really was. His thumb traced my cheekbone. If that's not a lesson in choosing what's worth fighting for, I don't know what is. I kissed him then, pouring everything I felt into it. Relief that he was safe, pride that he'd chosen us, love that had grown from cautious affection into something fierce and unshakable. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine. Marry me. My heart stuttered. What? Marry me, officially. Not just for the children, though they'd be thrilled. For us, because I want you in my life permanently, legally, irrevocably. That's not very romantic, I teased, even as tears gathered in my eyes. Olivia Reeves. He pulled back, taking both my hands. You walked into my home expecting a simple nanny job, and ended up saving not just my children, but me. You gave me permission to be more than the role I'd been playing. You showed me that family is worth more than empire. Will you marry me? Yes, I whispered. Yes, of course yes. His kiss was everything, relief and joy and promise. When we finally returned inside, hand in hand, Marco was standing in the hallway in his pajamas. I heard, he said, trying to look stern but failing as a smile broke through. You're really staying? I'm really staying. He nodded once, satisfied, then surprised us both by throwing his arms around my waist. Good, because we already told everyone at school you were going to be our mom. Over his head, Nico and I shared a look, part exasperated, part amused, completely in love. This chaotic, complicated, beautiful family was mine now. And I wasn't running anywhere. The wedding happened 6 weeks later in Nico's family's church in Sicily, with Marco as best man and Julia as flower girl. I wore my mother's restored wedding dress, simple lace that had been yellowed with age until Nonna Sofia had worked some Italian magic on it. Nico wore a tailored suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of a classic film. But the most important part wasn't the ceremony or the celebration after. It was the moment during our vows when Nico turned to Marco and Julia, who stood beside us at the altar. I promise, he said, his voice carrying through the small church, to be not just a husband to Olivia, but a father who puts family first. To build a life where you never have to fear losing the people you love. To show you that strength isn't about power or control, but about knowing what's worth protecting. Julia was crying, happy tears this time. Marco was trying not to, his jaw set in determination, until I reached out and pulled him into our circle. Then the tears came for him too. We weren't just joining two lives. We were officially becoming the family we'd been building all along. My mother attended the wedding, her treatment successful enough that she could travel. She'd been overwhelmed when I'd told her about Nico, worried about the danger, the complications. But watching him with the children during the reception, seeing how he'd transformed his entire life to keep us safe, she'd pulled me aside. That man worships you, she said, squeezing my hand. I can see it in every look, every touch. You chose well, baby. I chose dangerously, I corrected. Sometimes the same thing. She smiled. Sometimes the people worth loving are the ones who scare us a little because of how much they can change our lives. The reception lasted until dawn, filled with too much food, too much wine, and too many cousins trying to teach me traditional dances. Nico's family had accepted me completely, not as a replacement for Maria, but as my own person, with my own place in their hearts. Around 3 a.m, I found myself on the terrace of the family villa with a glass of champagne, watching the Mediterranean stars. "Tired?" Nico asked, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. Exhausted. I leaned back against his chest. Happy, terrified, all of it at once. Second thoughts? Not even a little bit. I turned in his arms, just processing that this is my life now, that I'm married to you, that Marco and Julia are officially mine. "The paperwork's already filed," he confirmed. "You're their legal mother as of this morning. My lawyer rushed it through before the wedding." Tears pricked my eyes for approximately the 100th time that day. "You didn't tell me. Wanted it to be a wedding gift." He kissed my forehead. "They're yours, Olivia. Legally, completely, irrevocably." I couldn't speak past the emotion clogging my throat, so I just held him, breathing in cedar and bergamot and the salt air, feeling more complete than I'd ever imagined possible. We returned to New York 2 weeks later to discover that Nico hadn't been exaggerating about walking away from the old business. His offices had been transformed. New staff, new focus, new operations entirely. The Castellano Corporation was now investing in legitimate real estate development, tech startups, and philanthropic ventures. "It's boring," one of his cousins complained during a family dinner. "You're basically a regular businessman now." "Exactly." Nico squeezed my hand under the table. "That's exactly the point." The transition wasn't seamless. There were threats from former rivals who felt he'd abandoned agreements. There were family members who resented his choice to go legitimate. There were nights when security had to be heightened, when I caught him staring out the penthouse windows with the weight of old decisions heavy on his shoulders. But he never wavered, never looked back. "Do you miss it?" I asked him one night, 3 months after the wedding, as we lay in bed. The power, the control, the empire. He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it. The clear lines between friend and enemy, ally and threat. But then I look at Marco thriving at school without constant security shadows. At Julia laughing without that undercurrent of fear. At you sleeping peacefully instead of jumping at every strange noise." He kissed my temple. "This is better. This is real." 6 months into our marriage, I discovered I was pregnant. The test sat on the bathroom counter, 2 pink lines staring accusingly at me while I tried to process what they meant. Another child. Ours together, biologically and completely. Marco and Julia's sibling. I'd assumed my family was complete. The children I'd fallen in love with, the man I'd married. It had seemed like enough. More than enough. But now... "Olivia?" Nico's voice came through the bathroom door. "Everything all right?" I opened the door to find him standing there, concern etched in his features. In response, I handed him the test. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at me, and I saw it. Pure, uncomplicated joy. "You're sure?" 3 tests, all positive. He pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. A baby. Our baby. "Are you happy?" I asked against his chest. "I know we didn't plan." "Plan?" He pulled back to look at me, cupping my face. "Tesoro, nothing about us has ever been planned. You weren't planned. The way I fell in love with you wasn't planned. This family we've built certainly wasn't planned. But it's all been perfect." Telling Marco and Julia was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. They were 8 and 6 now, old enough to understand what a new sibling meant. "Will you still love us?" Julia asked quietly, her hand instinctively finding her brother's. "When the new baby comes?" I knelt down to their level, Nico crouching beside me. "Remember when Papa and I got married, and we talked about how love doesn't divide, It multiplies? Marco nodded slowly. This is like that, Nico explained. The new baby won't take love away from either of you. It will just add more love to our family. Will it be a boy or girl? Marco asked, warming to the idea. We don't know yet, I admitted. I hope it's a girl, Julia decided. Boys are annoying. Hey, Marco protested, but he was smiling. Then, more seriously, does this mean you're our real mom now? Not just legally, but actually? What do you think? I asked softly. He thought about it, his young face serious. I think you became our real mom the first day you didn't run away when things got messy. And you've been choosing to stay ever since. The wisdom in his words, so far beyond his 8 years, made my heart ache. You're absolutely right. The pregnancy was remarkably smooth, nothing like the horror stories I'd heard. Nico was attentive to the point of being ridiculous, insisting on accompanying me to every appointment and reading every parenting book he could find, even though he'd already raised 2 children. This is different, he explained when I teased him about it. With Maria, the pregnancy felt like fulfilling an obligation. Beautiful, but duty. With you, it feels like choosing joy. Marco and Julia threw themselves into preparing for their new sibling with characteristic enthusiasm. Marco researched developmental stages, becoming a tiny expert on infant care. Julia spent weeks making welcome signs and decorating the nursery with construction paper art that gradually covered every available surface. The family rallied around us. Nonna Sofia arrived a month before the due date, taking over the kitchen and filling the penthouse with the smells of her cooking. Nico's aunts materialized with advice, presents, and enough baby clothes to outfit triplets. Even his uncles, the ones who'd been most vocal about his walking away from the family business, softened, seeing how happy he was. You were right, Uncle Stefano admitted during one of his visits, holding a tiny onesie awkwardly. About choosing family, I see it now. Isabella Castellano was born on a clear October morning, exactly 2 years after I'd first walked into the penthouse covered in glitter. She had Nico's dark hair and my green eyes, and from the moment Marco and Julia first held her, she became the center of their universe. She's so small, Julia whispered, carefully supporting Isabella's head just like we'd taught her. Was I this small? Smaller, Nico assured her. You were early, gave us quite a scare. Marco was more cautious, but the love in his face was unmistakable. Can I help feed her? You can help with everything, I promised. She's your sister. You're going to teach her everything you know. That first night home, with Isabella sleeping in her bassinet between our bed and the door, I found myself wide awake despite my exhaustion. Nico stirred beside me. Can't sleep? He murmured, just watching her. I reached for his hand, thinking about how different my life is from 2 years ago. Regrets? Not a single one. I looked at him in the darkness. I applied for a nanny job because I was desperate. I stayed because I fell in love. With your children, with your chaotic family, with you. And now look at us. He pulled me closer, careful not to jostle Isabella. We're disgustingly happy. Completely. A reformed Mafia boss playing at legitimate business. Succeeding at legitimate business, I corrected. A kindergarten teacher turned mother of 3. A family nobody could have predicted. Perfect, he finished. Absolutely perfect. 5 years passed in a blur of school plays, birthday parties, family dinners, and business expansions. Nico's legitimate ventures thrived, particularly his investment in tech startups and his philanthropic work. The Castellano Foundation, with me as director, became one of the city's largest charitable organizations. Funding education programs and medical assistance for families like mine had been. Marco grew into a thoughtful teenager who wanted to study international relations. Julia discovered a talent for art that reminded me of her creativity during our first pillow fight war. And Isabella. Isabella was a force of nature who inherited her father's intensity, my stubbornness, and her older siblings' complete inability to sit still. "She's exactly like you were," Nico said one evening, watching our youngest orchestrate an elaborate game involving her siblings, their cousins, and every toy in the playroom. "Like I was?" I laughed. "She's all you. Look at how she's commanding that room." "She gets that from you," he insisted. "The courage to take charge, to believe she belongs anywhere she chooses to be." I watched our children, all three of them, biological and chosen, loved equally and completely, and felt the same overwhelming gratitude that hit me regularly. This chaotic, beautiful, imperfect family that had started with a desperate job application and evolved into something neither of us could have imagined. "They're going to be okay," I said quietly. "All of them. We've given them something stable, something real." Nico pulled me close. "We've given them a family that proves love is a choice, that choosing each other, every single day, is what makes it real." On our 5th anniversary, Nico surprised me by taking me back to the penthouse playroom where we'd first met. It had been updated over the years, age-appropriate toys for growing children, a homework station, a reading nook. But the bones of it remained the same. "This is where it started," he said, gesturing around us. "Where you walked in covered in glitter and told me exactly how my children should be raised. And you hired me anyway. I hired you because of it." He moved closer. "Because you saw what mattered. Not the empire, not the power, not the name. Just the children who needed someone to stay. I stayed. You did more than stay." He pulled me into his arms. "You taught me that family isn't about bloodlines or empires passed through generations. It's about choosing each other, fighting for each other, building something together that's stronger than what we could build alone." From down the hall, we heard Isabella's shriek of laughter, followed by Marco's exasperated, "Julia, stop teaching her that!" And Julia's innocent, "What? She asked me to." "Our family's loud," I observed, smiling. "Our family's perfect," he corrected. And standing there in the playroom where our story began, surrounded by the evidence of children's chaos and love, I couldn't disagree. This wasn't the life I'd planned. It was better. Not because it was easy. It wasn't. Not because it was safe. We still had security, still dealt with occasional threats from Nico's past. Not because it was simple. Blending family and business and old wounds with new beginnings never was. But because every morning, we chose this. Chose each other. Chose the mess and the laughter and the challenge of building something real. I'd walked into this penthouse 2 years ago desperate and afraid, looking for a job. I'd found a family instead.